uh, Eric Schellenberg joining us. He has been involved with, well, I'll let him tell mostly about, he's a great colleague in Orange County Extension, but he's also got his own farm. And I hope he does give a little bit of an intro. I haven't been to his farm before, but I know that he's got a lot of experience growing a wide variety of plants. And he's going to talk about the Ericaceae family, some of the plants in that family, and Schisandra. And I hope he'll support me as I go through some of the other things as the second part of the talk. So Eric, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, that would be great.
All righty. All right, that one in presenter mode, all good?
Looks good.
Cool. All right, so very happy to be here. Thanks for putting this together. Pretty excited to talk about uncommon fruits in a professional setting because it's what I talk about most of the time in non-professional settings also. So my farm is called Black Creek Farm. I also have a nursery like the other presenters in the past couple days. You find that when you start to get into uncommon fruits or even regular fruits and you want to plant a lot of them, it's going to cost you a whole lot of money. And so you end up deciding, well, it probably makes sense for me to propagate some of these things myself. And then next thing you know, you become a nursery. It seems like a pretty easy transition because if you go and try to buy any of the plants we've been talking about, like whether it's currants or grafted pawpaws or anything like that, you realize, oh my God, this is going to cost way more than I have to put into it, being that it's a hobby for now. So at any rate, I grow most of the plants that we've been talking about for the past couple days. And unfortunately, the plants that I'm going to talk about today are some of the ones that I actually have the least experience with out of all the ones that have been discussed so far. That being said, I have planted a few of them here and there and certainly have something to share about them and have done a little bit of research. So what we're going to talk about is some of the uncommon Ericaceae plants. And then later we're going to talk about Schisandra, which is not the name of a exotic dancer. It is actually a vine instead. So first off, we're going to talk about Lingonberry, Vaccinium vitis idea. So I don't know if this is kind of an aside. I'm just going to try to move something around here so I can see the screen better. There we go. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this book in the bottom right here called Botany in a Day. Really wonderful book. It sort of is a different way of learning, presents a different way of learning plants by family. And so just put up a slide from there, the patterns of the Heath family. Each family has its kind of own unique characteristics, has a lot to do, identifying usually is easiest with the flower parts, the number of sepals and petals and stamens and things like that. Just kind of a cool book if you're interested in botany in general. So the Ericaceae family is the Heath family. And so obviously a lot of these we already know: blueberry, rhododendron, azaleas, huckleberry, cranberry, and lingonberry, which are the two that I'll be talking about here. So the name is derived from Norse lingir, which means heather or heathland, which they have a lot of up in the northern countries. It's a well-known berry in northern climates around the world: Scandinavia, Russia, a bunch of Baltic countries, Canada as well. And it was used extensively by indigenous people around the world, at least in the northern latitudes. It's been cultivated commercially in the Netherlands for over 75 years. It's used extensively for fresh eating. Personally, I really like it fresh as a fresh fruit. It's a little bit on the acid side. For those of you who are blueberry connoisseurs, I'm sure you've had some blueberries that are just really super sweet, and then some that have the sweet heat, they say, which means it's a little bit more acidic and sweet at the same time. And the lingonberry is to the more acidic side of that scale, but there's definitely some notable sweetness. It has a pretty good vitamin C content. There's a lot of medicinal uses for it that I will also avoid talking about because of our general uncomfortable, it's not very comfortable for us to talk about medicinal
Oh,
use
go
and
ahead,
stuff like
Eric. Go ahead.
that. Okay, it'll raise your vibrational frequency, all right? So the ORAC values are around 8,000 to 9,000 micromoles per 100 grams. I'm not sure whether that was the standard unit of measure that they were using earlier in the talk for the past couple days. That's the one that I have seen with the best comparative scales that compares it to the other different kinds of fruits. And I do have a graph that I'll share at the end. So here is the actual plant growing. Those are the flowers, lingonberry. Just a little bit about the biology here. So it's a very low growing evergreen semi-woody shrub. It's normally at home in kind of montane and other heath environments. There are populations of them growing in the White Mountains. I've picked them on Mount Washington actually I picked a gallon of them one time, which was pretty awesome. So there's two varieties, generally Vaccinium vitis idea, var vitis idea, and then var minus. So they're just smaller. And sorry, this thing keeps getting in the way here. So the first one grows up to 2 feet tall and produces larger berries. It's hardy to about zone 4. That's probably the one that you'd be interested in if you're going to do any kind of cultivation. The other one being smaller in both size of plant and the fruit, much hardier though, hardy to zone 2. So if you're in a, I don't know, Adirondacks or Northern Vermont or something like that, maybe that would be the one. There are some hybrids that do occur as well. And they can grow in summers as warm as zone 7, but the hotter summer tends to diminish their growth and they do tend to be a little bit more susceptible to diseases. This is what they look like when they're ready to harvest. So they are generally self-fertile, but they do tend to have better production when they're being cross-pollinated, which occurs best around 60 degrees. The plants have a root mat of fine, shallow roots. It produces runners that can be used as propagation stock, and they will spread if left alone. The roots are somewhat similar to blueberries in that they are arbuscular mycorrhiza associates, so they don't have the tiny little root hairs, and so they won't be able to get all the nutrients they need unless the soil is exactly right for the fungi that they need to associate with. So spring flowering is often followed by a second flowering in midsummer, and they produce 2 different crops of berries in warmer climates. And the second crop is important, as we'll see. There's a close-up. So the cultural requirements are, in terms of the soil type, it's pretty generally similar to blueberries. And it may be that those of you who already have existing high bush blueberry plantings and want to see how the plant grows and get to know it a little bit, it may be most convenient and easiest to add them into an existing blueberry planting if you do have space and that would be possible. It's not competitive against weeds at all, so the area has to be really pretty much weed-free before planting. Very high organic matter requirements. The ideal pH is around 4.5 to 5.5. And I've got a picture in a second, but the planting pattern for just a lingonberry planting is generally with rows 4 to 5 feet apart and plants of idea planted on 18-inch centers in the row. They will eventually fill out like a 30-inch wide bed full of stems. So it's sort of like having a strip of straight plants in a 30-inch wide bed. Especially in the establishment year, it's really important to have even moisture. You need to mulch them at least 2 inches deep with a low nutrient, high carbon mulch at planting, and pretty much need to top that up every year for maintenance. They'll need at least 1 inch of water per week during planting year to establish properly. So here's a picture of that kind of scenario. This is a very well-drained sandy soil, but with adequate moisture. So you don't want to plant them in a sandy soil and not have irrigation. So this is black plastic with irrigation, drip underneath, and on a well-draining soil. So you're able to keep the, and of course, just like when you're planting a blueberry planting or anything else in the heath family, getting the pH down to the 4.5 to 5.5 range before planting is really important. You can do that with agricultural sulfur, or read the recommendations just like you would for a blueberry planting, because that sulfur takes time to actually make the pH adjustment in the soil. So getting that dialed in first, and then getting the field ready for the planting is definitely the way to go. So there's a really good book. I'm pretty sure it was already been mentioned. This is Uncommon Fruits for Every Garden by Lee Reich. And he does have a whole section of lingonberry information in here. His recommendation in the book is 1 pound of soybean meal per 100 square feet. There are some recommendations for commercial production with conventional fertilizers that are also included in one of the references that I put, which is Lingonberry Production Guide for the Pacific Northwest. That was the only one that I was able to find as far as production guide for America. And of course, the Northwest, as we know, is a very different climate from the Northeast, but a lot of their fertilizer and pH recommendations are probably the same. So a couple other things that you want to keep in mind for maintenance is if there's, like most plants, if there's a yellowing of the lower leaves, we're probably looking at a nitrogen deficiency. But if there's an interveinal yellowing on the newer growth near the tops of the plants, that's probably an iron deficiency, and that probably has to do with pH problems. So if you're working in a field that normally has a higher pH, of 6.5 or 7 or something like that, and you worked with sulfur to try to get the pH down, you probably are going to have that pH creeping up over the years, whether it's from watering with calcified water or the water table bringing it up. Either way, you really need to keep an eye on that pH, because if it starts creeping up, you're going to start seeing that yellowing on the new growth. The veins stay green and the interveinal area starts to yellow, and that's when it's probably gotten a little bit out of hand. So that might be something where you need to put in elemental sulfur in the plantings to keep that from creeping up. Pruning, you really don't need to do much for 5 or 6 years. The commercial way of renewing is to take a portion of the whole planting and mow it down, basically almost flush to the ground, and leave an inch every 3 or 4 years. And so you plant a larger area than you plan on harvesting every year, and every year you're mowing a portion down. So if you want to do it on a 3 to 4 year cycle, you're going to mow a third or a quarter of your planting every year and rotate that around the patch so that you always have some areas in their highest production. So full crop can be expected around 3 to 4 years after establishment. It is a pretty good yielding berry, potentially. 5 tons per acre is a yield in a well-maintained planting with good soil characteristics. It can be harvested with a low bush blueberry berry comb rake. Pretty easy to get your hands on that. Berries stay ripe on the bush for months. The harvest window is very long. Even into hard freezing temperatures, they stay good. And the post-harvest shelf life is pretty much amazing. It's actually the opposite of a lot of these fruits that we've been talking about over the past couple days, with pawpaws going bad about 12 minutes after you take them off the tree. Instead, because of high benzoic acid concentration, lingonberries can stay good for 2 months or more after harvest. And there are some other ways of keeping them, which I don't really think are probably that great from a food safety perspective, but there was water preservation, which basically you just take the berries and put them in water. So they don't want to ferment because the benzoic acid for a really, really long time, and aerobic bacteria and fungi aren't able to get at them. So they pretty much just stay good for like up to half a year, just submerged in water. So it is a pretty well developed crop, mostly because of European breeding and selection. There are a lot of named varieties. I personally have no idea how to get my hands on any of these. I don't know. You can get a couple. There's a couple nurseries that sell named varieties, but it's like a potted plant for $30. I don't know of many places that sell wholesale quantities of plantable stuff. I can't remember. Hartman's might have some. Maybe someone else can share if they know that. But here are the highest yielding varieties. Ida is kind of the basic variety that most of the European markets grow. And so, yeah, this is basically just a yields pound per acre curve. As you can see, 30,000, that's pretty crazy yield. And as far as marketing and processing, a lot of Europeans, Eastern Europeans, Northern Europeans will probably buy berries fresh in a pretty decent amount. If you're already up and running with jams and preserves, this is a shoe-in for that. You can do pure jams, you can do all kinds of mixes, adds a really nice acidic flavor. And yeah, it's very easy to incorporate into a wide variety of value-added products. So again, the Lingonberry production guide for the Pacific Northwest is really pretty thorough in terms of fertility, soil prep, varieties, maintenance and all that kind of thing. And there's another link that I included, economic evaluation of Lingonberry production in Oregon, which is obviously goes a little bit more in detail into the economics of plantings. Of course, that's focused on a little bit of a larger scale, not necessarily for pick your own or that kind of thing. And then uncommon fruits for every garden, much smaller scale recommendations and ideas there. Do you think we should go on to the next one and then take questions, or take questions now, or?
Do you mind stopping for a couple of questions?
Not at all.
So there were some questions, and I certainly would love to know what you thought. Can we grow these right under the blueberry row, or maybe on the outside of the blueberry row?
I think that we could. It is just a matter of light, obviously. In your blueberry planting, if you have a wider spacing and there's a lot of light maybe hitting the south side of the base of the plants, maybe we could sneak them in on the south side where there's probably some more light coming in low. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As long as it doesn't really severely get in the way of picking when you're, trying to walk closer to the plants. But
right.
Yeah, as long as you can manage it so that you get the light and you are able to walk around the plants, I think it could make sense. And as certainly, if you want to give it a try and see whether it's worthwhile to increase the plantings or not, I think that's a great way of kind of just dipping your toe in, and maybe you get a decent crop and then they're not in, nobody's interested in buying them. I don't think that will happen, but at least then you don't have to have a whole planting. Or maybe when you plant a new blueberry field, you can interplant it with the lingonberries and get a couple years of good yield on the lingonberries before the blueberries really get full size and start shading things out. So yeah, it seems like if you're going to go through all the work of preparing a blueberry field, incorporating these might be a nice way to try to start out with them.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. And David makes a point that I didn't really think about, the fact that if they are fragile, and we've got, especially maybe even worse when we're pruning blueberries, kind of stomping around on them in the winter might be a real challenge. But
Yeah.
yeah, I do think that, we do put so many inputs into trying to get that blueberry field right. It would be very cool to see if we could make it double down a little bit.
Yeah, it's always cool to interplant things, but it always complicates the management to a pretty crazy degree. And managing most of my plantings is like you couldn't hire someone to do it because it would be too hard to explain even what's going on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Um, uh, Somebody earlier asked about where that one picture of the plants on the plastic was. Do you know where that picture came from?
That's from Oregon.
Oh,
So
from Oregon. Okay.
yeah, yeah. There's some pretty significant plantings in Oregon and Washington. That's why all the literature is being developed there.
Okay, cool. And Mike is wondering if you recommended planting some pollinator varieties. Do most varieties also produce a small summer crop?
The summer crop is so the second flowering is usually produces a larger portion of the crop than the first flowering. Um, and generally, from what I read, I don't know for sure, but from what I read, it's similar to blueberries where yes, you can have a block of one variety and you'll get probably pretty decent pollination, but it's better to have a few different varieties around just to make sure that you get total full-on pollination. And another one to consider with pollination is, so yes, you need the pollinizing plants. They are, like I said, they're self-fertile, but they'll probably get better yield with more, a couple different varieties in there. And native pollinator habitat is pretty important with these. Similar to blueberries, honeybees will pollinate them, but they're not very good at it. And native bees are much more efficient at doing it. And, it can just be a little, couple hour winter project to make a bunch of pollinator habitat to attract some of the blue orchard bees and a bunch of other different species that are much better at making sure they get pollinated.
All right, that's a great point. All right, great. Thanks, Eric. Guess we can
Cool.
keep going. I haven't seen anything else.
All right, so we're gonna jump into cranberries. And to be honest, I was a little bit scared and intimidated to talk about cranberries because it's a pretty developed, it's unusual in a certain sense, but in actual fact, in the United States, it's a massively developed industry, as I'm sure you all know. And I didn't know exactly, I don't really think that we're going to be trying to replicate the industry standards here. So I'm going to try to talk about a couple different ways to approach it. So again, in the heath family, Vaccinium macrocarpon, there's a bunch of different species. Macrocarpon is the one that we're most interested in and is native to the US. So the United States produces more than half the world's entire harvest of this crop. It's established in Wisconsin and New Jersey and Massachusetts, of course, Oregon and Washington as well. There's well-established markets for fresh berries, dried, sauce. I don't think many people just eat for the fresh cranberries. I think they're mostly making sauces at home. High in vitamin C, pretty decent in B5, B6, E, and K, manganese, very high antioxidants. There is actually some clinical research linking consumption to lower UTI risk as well. Here's just a map of the regions. The red are the really high production regions, and the green have some. I couldn't really, maybe someone else who knows a little bit more than I do has an idea. I couldn't really tell you why it is in those specific regions grown much more than the other ones. Because, for example, Massachusetts is right next to New York, and New York has plenty of peat bogs of various different types. And I'm not exactly sure why it's not grown here. I do not think that it's environmental in nature, the reason why it's not a big crop in New York. I have a feeling that it's probably more historical, economic. We're, for example, we can't just drain a bog right now. If it's over a certain size, it's a federally protected wetland. But I don't know why the industry developed in Massachusetts and New Jersey and never developed in New York. And I'm sure there's a good historical reason for that, but I couldn't find one. So I'd be curious if anybody has an idea. So it's another semi-woody creeping evergreen growing in acidic bogs, can tolerate 4.2 to 5.5 pH. It can tolerate extensive root zone saturation. It doesn't need that. In fact, it needs to not have that for certain times of the year. The rhizomes, runners, or vines support upright stems, and those bear the fruit and the flowers, usually in their second and third year of growth. So the roots grow in 4 to 6 inches of soil. Again, they have no root hairs. They are pollinated by bees, and individual plants can live and produce for centuries. So renovation of plantings, although it occurs, it doesn't need to happen for very long periods of time. So here's the flower, pretty unique look. So just a little bit about the economic history. Cranberries have been a really big business for a long time. In the early 1900s, fresh production began to increase until it really outstripped demand, and cooperatives started to form. So they began canning the excess fruit, and they merged into what we know now as Ocean Spray in 1930. I found one kind of interesting thing. It was called the Great Cranberry Scare of 1959. Sounds like a pretty good horror movie. It actually was, because there was the herbicide aminotriazole got laced into some cranberries there, and it's a pretty persistent and gnarly herbicide. And so there was some, real health concerns around that. So I don't know if it was in response to that exactly, but they developed a federal marketing order for cranberries, which is basically the same concept of OPEC. So it's kind of like a bunch of producers are able to control or have an influence over the supply of the market. So it's a supply side economics thing that the government gives them the ability to do that. So it's a kind of a weird scene. The Canadians have a couple of these kind of systems with like the Canadian Wheat Board, although that's a monopsony. It's a little bit different, but it's not necessarily just like a free market kind of thing. It's pretty regulated. Cranberry shipment seized by Chicago. It's kind of nice and maybe not so nice at the same time to see that not much has changed in the news. I just looked up this about the cranberry scare, and you can see the headlines look familiar no matter what decade you're in. So cultural practices, it's a very unique crop. It's not something that you're just going to be able to integrate into your normal way of farming necessarily. It has the high organic matter needs with the low pH. Of course, like we've been talking about, the pH can be adjusted with sulfur. You don't want to put on more than 500 pounds an acre per year. Should be split into 2 applications at least. Can't really absorb any more than that at a time. Nitrogen can be added with ammonium sulfate to help continue that acidification trend. So if you're flooding or irrigating and that tends to increase the pH, again, you may have to continue to add sulfur as a yearly input. That's something you're going to have to be monitoring really closely with pH. So if we're going to plant cranberries, whether it's a small plot, medium size, or a couple acres, we are talking about engineered systems. There are, like I said, in Massachusetts and New Jersey, there are a bunch of natural systems that they plant into and kind of re-engineer. And there is an ethical consideration there if we're looking at, larger bogs. In wetlands, well, a lot of the time they're just protected. Although I will be honest, there's a kind of a gray area. An agricultural operation can plow into a wetland, and plant crops. You're not allowed to drain a wetland right now without Army Corps and a bunch of other approvals. But if you have a wetland and you are farming in a wetland or grazing it, that's okay, as you know, not across the board, but that's generally there are no regulations to prevent farms from farming them, but clearing them or draining them or changing the hydrology in any way is completely different, and that's, you know, needs all kinds of approvals that you probably won't get. So you're not going to go out and find a peat bog on your farm and drain it and put cranberries in there, most likely. That you'll probably not get the approvals to do that. So you're going to have to engineer something. So the ideal situation is an impervious layer that's about 8 inches below grade, topped with wet peat moss, and then 2 inches of sand on the very top. So essentially, the cranberry roots are going to grow in wet peat moss and have a sand mulch. That sand mulch is reducing the weeding and increases the growth of the cranberries. It's not only a mulch for weeds. There were some studies that showed that the cranberries grow better when they're next to these sand dunes and the sand was blowing in, and I'm not sure whether that was the fertility or what, but they grow better in the sand. It probably has something to do with heat dynamics as well. So again, it's possible to try to do some planting under high bush blueberry plantings here. The cranberries can tolerate flooding, but they don't need it. It's kind of like blueberry plants. Often you'll go out in a bog and you'll find blueberry plants growing in a bog, but that doesn't mean that we want to go plant high bush blueberry plantings in a wet area. It means because they're normally growing in a bog on tussock grasses or on something else that's keeping it 8 or 10 inches out of the water, so that the roots are actually getting some air, but have good access to moisture all the time. So there are a bunch of different ways you could go about doing it. Again, the problem of incorporating it into existing plantings is that maintenance issue and the access issue, and are you going to be trampling them and destroying them anyway? Or if you're really being careful not to, are you going to increase your pruning hours of labor and, you know, become economical that way? So if you're going to make an engineered system, you know, a smaller plot, you could again, if you're going to make a pure cranberry plot, there's a bunch of different ways that you could go about it. You could plant the plants on a 2 by 2 foot grid. That's if you're going to buy really large containers like 1 gallon pots, or you could do a 1 foot by 1 foot grid for smaller rooted cuttings, if that's what you're able to get. Lower density planting is possible, but it's going to take longer to colonize the entire growing area. So because they're growing with these vines, the rhizomes are going to go out in every direction. So it's going to be, you're going to think of it like a vining crop. It's going to basically create a mat. It's not going to be kept in rows where you're cultivating in between or anything like that. So here's a cross section of what you'd want to basically create. You've got your impervious clay layer. If you don't have clay and you have well-draining loam or sandy loam or whatever, I have seen it where people just put down a liner. You can put down a pond liner or a piece of plastic or something like that, a little bit of gravel so that the peat doesn't stay completely saturated. But essentially, you want impervious and then a little bit of gravel for a drainage bed, and then just solid peat and then sand. And that's what the roots are going to be down in here, and they're going to be layering naturally into the sand, dipping down into the peat, and your uprights are going to come off of these rhizomes. In the first 2 years, very little nitrogen should be added. The rhizomes will colonize the planting area, and it's in fact the low nitrogen that will encourage them to stop growing so vigorously vining, and instead they'll start to produce the uprights. As far as water needs, the cranberry bogs should not be flooded during the growing season. That's kind of contrary to, I mean, what you see in nature sometimes, but also kind of my idea of cranberries was, yeah, growing in a wet bog. But although they can survive inundation, they really don't want that during the growing season. But the peat substrate should never dry out completely. That will kill the rhizomes in a very short period of time. It needs to be moist. As far as maintenance, it's probably a good idea to put in about 1/2 inch of sand mulch every year to help production and act as a weed barrier. Pruning, really infrequent, but for small plots, cutting the long runners every decade or so shows an increase in the growth of the uprights. So the way this is achieved is you take a rake and you rake through the sand, and the long runners will kind of straighten out under the tines of your rake, and then you can just cut them if they're really, super long, 4 or 5 feet long. You just cut them a couple times. It has pretty low fertility needs, but again, you want to watch for the interveinal yellowing with the high pH. Monitor pH to keep it in that range, and you can achieve that with sulfur. Nitrogen needs need to be determined through testing, and usually ammonium sulfate is what they use. So again, I'm just going to talk a minute here or two about large acreage. It's a completely different beast. This is large capital investment, engineering wetlands, enormous amounts of peat, bringing in huge amounts of sand. You have to be able to control the water table. There may be marketing regulations involved if you get to a certain size. There's all kinds of mechanized harvesting equipment that's very specialized and expensive. If you're interested in it, go and check it out. It's not far away at all. New Jersey or Massachusetts, there's lots of farms you could probably visit. This is the kind of scale that they're operating. This is a farm in Massachusetts. This is wet picking here where, they flood, they have control over, it's kind of like a rice paddy where they have control over all of these water levels. And when they finally ripen up and they go to harvest, they just float them to the top. And yeah, these machines in the bottom right there, in the flooded, are able to drive through, soft flooded peat and lift the berries off the uprights and float them. So there's a really thorough guide, Cranberry Production, a guide for Massachusetts through UMass Extension. This is a cross section of, basically the engineered wetlands that you'd have to be creating. So just below here, it got cut off. Sorry about that. Is the water table is just at the bottom here. Native soil is the water confining layer. So that's your impervious, probably clay. Organic layer, this is your peat, 8 to 12 inches. And then cranberry bog sand, a little bit deeper here. And ditches and dikes. And so you need to be able to control that water table if you want to do wet harvesting. So this is a very, very large and involved project. And unless you have an area that is naturally suited to this, it would be uneconomical to do it. Quick word about pests and diseases. So in smaller plantings with good pH and water, the pests and diseases are pretty rare. However, you will probably see a few of them. There's cranberry tipworm, eats the growing tip of the uprights, and that will prevent fruiting the following year. They usually fly around May, and yellow soap water traps can work to lessen that. Cranberry fruitworm, early fruit coloration in August indicates infestation with worms, so you should remove those fruits. And red spot and berry fruit rot can both be controlled pretty well with copper sprays. Harvest usually lands somewhere around in October, and you want to get them before a frost of lower than 30 degrees, which can, permanently damage the fruit. When the seeds in the fruit mature and turn brown, that's when you know that they've reached complete ripening. Deep red coloration is a little bit dependent on the variety. Classic varieties like Ben Lear and Early Black are a nice deep red, almost like a maroon. And then some other varieties can be much lighter red, even with some whitish, yellowish part on the side of the fruit that's not getting so much light. And it can be fully ripe at that point. So you want to check the seeds. So just a little bit about those ORAC levels. Cranberry is up here, right next to blueberries. Lingonberry also around 9,000. So all these ericaceous plants are right in that area. Wild blueberry is a little bit higher. And again, that aronia right almost at the top, other than ground cinnamon, which isn't really fair because ground cinnamon is like dried and concentrated. So I think that should be removed personally. So any questions on the ericaceous crops?
There were a couple of questions about whether or not we should be trying to substitute something for the peat, and some conversation about peat usage.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't think that there's any other substrates that have been really tested that you could point to. That being said, there are, there are some ethical considerations around large uses of peat. Our industry, all plant industries use pretty profound amounts of peat. However, you can go and look up the peat harvesting sustainability, and you will see that the total extraction of peat is, something like less than 2% of the area of the peat bogs in Canada, and they regenerate faster than they are being harvested. So right now, the harvest could be said to be sustainable. That doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, that's fine, use tons of it, because of course we'll probably get to a point where we're using more than we should, and that doesn't mean we should use the resource for no reason. But there aren't many materials that I think would have the same type of characteristics. The closest that I could think of would be shredded barks, maybe a shredded pine bark. There's a lot of plants that, seedlings and cuttings and propagate well in peat and also in shredded bark. So there may be some crossover there, but again, that's completely unknown and untested as far as I've seen. But doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. Shredded oak leaves have really high acidity and tannins as well. Any kind of pine needles, all that kind of stuff could eventually, you could probably pioneer and make some other great substrates, mixing like barley hulls and shredded cambium of poplars or coppiced willows that are ground up, and mix it with needles and whatever. You could come up with something that will probably have chemical and physical attributes similar to peat, but probably a pretty big project.
Yeah, I think though there's some that would be really interesting, because when you start talking about substrate, you start talking about a lot of very unsustainable approaches. Compared to coconut coir, I feel like this might not be such a bad idea having peat. But anyway, so there's just some chat about different sources for lingonberry, and people have been sharing that, which is great. There's one more question, Eric, about maybe using cranberry on the side underneath a blueberry row might actually be even better than lingonberry if you wanted to just grow a small amount.
Mm-hmm.
And then, sorry, go ahead.
Did they explain why it might be better than lingonberry, or was it just was there a reason?
Because it was flatter and shorter than lingonberry, it might be kind of like a living mulch.
Yeah, the only issue there that I would foresee is that the lingonberries, they will colonize and root out a little bit, but they more kind of stay in their place. Whereas the cranberries, if things are growing really well, they're going to want to spread out, which might be nice in the row, but you'll have to manage so that they don't, walk into your drive lane or whatever.
Yeah. I just think cranberry is such an interesting crop because it doesn't have a lot of the attributes that we normally think of for these commercial plants. It kind of went against it, and somehow it became really popular, maybe just because for some reason it became ingrained in our Thanksgiving ritual, and then it gained a foothold. It's just very, very odd. It kind of goes against all the things that we think of as why plants gain commercial approval.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I think that there is something to be said that, like, you know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the landscape of the Northeast, there was a lot of wetlands and bogs. And when people started to colonize this area and started to clear and make farms, they ran into huge areas of that. And, you know, that's what we see with the remains of the muck growing regions in the Northeast. And, you know, there is some, I think, pretty good reason that they would have wanted to make use of those areas, because they're very, you know, bogs um, and some wetlands can be very fertile areas, but you know, you have to have a crop that can live there if you're not going to be able to just drain the whole thing and grow normal crops in it.
Right. Yeah, it's a interesting one. And I do get a lot of questions about people wanting to grow cranberries for very small scale. And so this has been really helpful. And that said, the same thing about that scale, the cranberry grower that was in, I think it's Oneida County, apparently they're looking for a different crop. They're the same problem as somebody mentioned in the chat, that the ocean spray dropped them when the prices fell, and so they don't have a contract, and it's just a real challenge. So okay, I think this is the fruit that people have been waiting to hear about, because it is really unusual, and just learning about this plant. So let's move on to Schisandra,
Okay.
or Schisandra.
Yeah, I don't know how to say it. Schisandra, Schisandra. I don't think there's a right way. I think everybody can say it however they want. So I'll be upfront about my experience. I have a couple vines. They're young. I really don't know a lot about this plant yet. I'm very excited to, however, because the fruit is just bizarre and it's interesting and it's wildly medicinal. Um, Again, go if you're interested, go on Google Scholar, look up Schisandra chinensis, and be prepared to spend as much time as you have trying to figure out what is actually known about this crop. It's one of the 50 essential Chinese medicinal herbs, and it's called the five flavored plant because different parts of it taste completely different, and different individuals will eat the same berry and taste completely different things. And there's all kinds of theories as to why that is. I don't know if any of you have ever eaten or tasted the rhizome of a plant called Acorus calamus, also known as sweet flag. That's another medicinal, that's a plant that grows in wetlands. It kind of looks like a cattail. Anyway, when I first ate the berry, I just thought that I was chewing on a piece of Acorus calamus. So it tasted exactly like that to me. And then when I cracked the seed open, it tasted like something completely different. I would not recommend doing what I did and eating a whole seed because it's so intense and there's so much going on that you just kind of, your brain shuts down. So I think using it as, you know, some of the medicinal preparations where it's much reduced in potency and concentration are there for a reason. So what is it? It's a deciduous woody vine. It's native to the forests of northern China and far east Russia. It is hardy to zone 4. Um, the plant likes some shade with moist, well-drained soil, and the species is dioecious. Also, these slides were given to me by Marvin Pritz. Really great guy, knows a ton about berries. I'm sure you've all heard of him. And um, you know, I'm trying to put together information on this plant, and it's, as some of you probably know, if you're interested in this plant, it's very hard to find any detailed information. There is no growing guide that I could find that was printed in English or any language that I could understand. So um, there's a lot to be determined here. The berries of Schisandra are given the name Wu Wei Zi in Chinese, which translates to the 5 flavored fruit. So they possess all the 5 basic flavors in herbal medicine: salty, sweet, sour, pungent, and bitter. So in traditional Chinese medicine, it's used as a remedy for things like resisting infections, skin health, insomnia, coughing, thirst, you name it. It's also pretty well known in Korea. One of the 50 fundamental herbs And there is a real industry for it in other parts of the world. There's tens of tons of berries are used annually in Russia for the commercial manufacture of juices, wines, extracts, and sweets. So there is a commercial grower in Pioneer Valley in Watley, Massachusetts. Dr. Chang's farm is what I found online. They were organic certified. I found a little website about their organic certification, and their websites, as far as I can tell, are no longer active. If anyone else has information about the farm that you can share, or it would be okay to share, that would be awesome. I'm still awaiting a follow-up to see if I can get in touch with them. So again, pictures from Marvin here, and all of this is Schisandra. So it's 4 or 5 acres or something like that of Schisandra vines. So pretty substantial planting. These are the vines up close, extremely vigorous. Just after a couple of years of establishing kind of slowly, they form like a rhizomatous mat on the bottom here. It's a pretty intense vine. I think there is, as far as the conversation goes around invasiveness, it's a very aggressive growing plant when it gets to a certain age. And I have no idea, and I don't know if anyone has any idea as to what would happen if the berries, start to be distributed out into the landscape. It's just an unknown. And I think this planting, if anything, going and poking around in the wilderness around this planting would probably give you an idea, because it's well established. It's obviously been bumping out berries for many years, and if the birds are going to move them like they do with Oriental bittersweet or something like that, they would have already done it. So, but like Laura said the other day, sometimes a species can kind of sit and simmer for a decade, and then all of a sudden it goes crazy, and who can tell? But I guess it's better for that to happen with something that's super medicinal than something that we can eat. I don't know. So here are the unripe berries, starting to blush a little bit there, and then fully ripe. So just a note on varieties. If you go and look around to buy plants, what you'll find is Eastern Prince, Apricot Blush, which is another female, and then Valentine, which is a male pollinizer. I love the clever nursery names they come up with. Eastern Prince, so they say it's self-fertile. There are a few growers, Jesse Stevens up in Maine. I can't remember the name of his nursery, but he's definitely on NAFEX. If you look on the Facebook NAFEX group, NAFEX stands for North American Fruit Explorers, and Jesse Stevens, he has a pretty extensive experience with Schisandra. He sells fruits, seedlings, propagated plants from vegetative propagation. And so Eastern Prince is reportedly self-fertile. And again, I think it does a little bit better if there are male pollinizers around. The other thing about the sex of Schisandra is that it can it's a little bit like persimmons. I don't know if we discussed this. They can kind of switch. So if persimmons and Schisandra are female and they're there for years not getting pollinated, they'll figure it out somehow. They'll either produce some pollen themselves, start to make perfect flowers, start to make male flowers. You look into the literature about it, and some plants just have the ability to make sure that they produce viable seeds after long enough of not being pollinated. So I have a feeling that if you're just interested in it for the medicinal properties and you can get your hands on Eastern Prince, great. if you can get your hands on seeds and grow out seeds, which germinate really well after just a regular cold stratification, I think if you grew out, a handful of seeds, eventually they'll probably figure it out and you'll probably get fruit. I wouldn't worry about that too much. So a lot of the interest in this fruit has to do with nutraceuticals, value-added kind of things. And I guess the planting over in the Pioneer Valley was doing a lot of this as well. I don't know where that stands now, but I don't know if this is going to be a U-pick fruit. And again, this is a very potent medicinal plant, so it's not something that you want people to come and eat handfuls of. Not that they would. It tastes so incredibly strong that no one would want to do that. But it's something I think to be pretty responsible with because it's a very, very potent medicine. So that's all I had. I'm happy to try to answer questions or direct you in whichever direction I can.
All right, thanks. Thanks very much. Who knew that there were so many people growing this plant? That's pretty exciting. A lot of
That's
chat.
awesome.
Yeah. And I just, Sonia Schloman, who was on the call, I had told Eric I thought the planting in Whately, Mass was smaller, but she has said that at one point they had 20 acres planted. So it's a big planting, really kind of interesting. I'm just trying to see if there's any specific questions. There's a lot of chat, but I don't see. If somebody has a question, they could unmute and ask it verbally because I'm not seeing specific questions. Just lots of sharing.
Great.
Okay, there was a question, Jennifer just had a question about thoughts on pricing. If these are mostly going for dry and medicinal use, sales to processors. Boy, Eric, what do you think? I don't really know that.
That's a tough question. And it's a really good question because I think if you're going to put in a substantial planting of vines, at least in the Hudson Valley, there are an enormous amount of herbalists and apothecaries and people who have local tea companies and things like that. And those kind of industries seem to be on the rise. And, growing medicinals to supply other people who end up doing the processing and blending and making, herbal medicines and remedies and things like that, I think is a very viable path forward. So, but again, as far as the actual, what that means for the pricing, I don't know, but it should be obviously very high because they're making a value added product. A little tincture like this, that bottle is probably minimum $25. So, and there aren't a whole lot of berries in there because these are, like I said, they're very potent. And when you do a tincture or you do some kind of special extraction, you're not using an enormous amount of the vine. So 20 acres is like, wow, what were they doing with all that? I'm sure they had some plants, but
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to not answer your question in the slightest, but I would I would say, talk to the buyers, ask them what they can get for their herbal remedies and make sure that, you're not giving them bulk fruit prices because if they're getting really good prices for not doing, a tincture doesn't take a huge amount of work, but it does take a lot of work to market it and do all that stuff. So, I don't know, just talk to them and make sure that you get, at least a good chunk of that value.
Eric, can you hear me or would you like to unmute? Eric, not Eric Schellenberg, but Eric, the other Eric that just chatted to me about unmuting.
Oh,
Can you?
Laura, can you hear me?
Yes, you're kind of quiet, but go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean you. I meant that for Allison. Allison's been talking about, hey, grow the arbors this tall and make sure moist. And I meant that for Allison.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Allison, would you like to? That's all right. No problem. Okay, I'm not hearing from her.
I'm
but we'll-
sorry. Hi.
Hi.
I don't mean to step on any feet. Yeah, we've been growing this for about 8 or 9 years now. And I think there's an amazing market for it. We did have a person come by last spring and buy, I think 20 cuttings that we had, wanting to establish a small Schisandra farm. And I think, as you said, Eric, there's a lot of herbalists that are in the area. And I think that they would prefer to buy something if it's not at least, has the organic label, that it's not coming in from China. And you're right. Do you need to have 20 acres of Schisandra? I don't think so. But I think having a couple of acres interspersed with, other main crops, you're hitting a market that really hasn't opened yet. And I forget, we did a little bit of research for something that we're working on, and the price per pound was amazing. Just as you said, that little tinctured bottle, but just even the raw fruits or the raw dried fruits, which store really well for a long period of time. We try and turn people on to growing the plant. So we've made a drink. Someone asked, how did we do it? We just boil it down, but you do have to add a sweetener to it. It's way too acidic and tart, but it's really refreshing. And as I wrote in the feed in Russia, it's used as for athletes to give them stamina and strength. So no doubt that the person who let their kids eat that, their kids were up all night from just gouging. Anyway, that was my little contribution, plus the other two selections you mentioned. My understanding, there's zone 7. We're growing apricot blush, but I can't seem to find any Valentine, just because we're trying to grow for diversity here. We're not a farm, we're more a botanical garden. So if anyone on this feed knows about that, just to see if it is hardy, but the apricot's been growing now for, I think it's in its 2nd year, and it's taken off. So anyway,
Sorry,
yeah.
did you say Eastern Prince was hardy to zone 7? Because I
Eastern Prince's zone is easily zone 6, but probably zone 5. But the other
Yeah.
two that you mentioned, Valentine and apricot blush, that I believe is, I don't know, sometimes you can't really read catalogs what they say, but they're saying zone 7, but
okay.
we're in zone 6, and I think, right now it's doing fine. We'll see.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. That's awesome to
Of
hear
course.
someone's been growing it for a while.
Of course.
Yeah, that's exciting. All right, so there are a couple more questions, I think directed towards Allison and trying to get cuttings and things, so, or Erica maybe, so I'll let you guys figure that out. And I think we're gonna jump into a completely different plant family. Thank you, Eric, so much for
Yeah,
sharing, and please stick around, because I think there'll be some more questions for you. And I knew Roger couldn't make it today, and I don't think that Steve is on the call. So it'd be really good to have
Yep, I'll be around.
backup. Thank you. All right, so we're just gonna jump in and see if we can cover a few things. These are just repeat slides trying to remind us about the characteristics of uncommon fruit and what makes them suitable for commercialization. And I do just think that kind of the juxtaposing the cranberry situation, and there's some real problems that happen when something gets too big and maybe the market is not as big as it should be for that plant. Then you have to really work hard to try to keep the whole operation viable. And we're doing a completely different thing here. We don't have markets for a lot of these things, so we're creating markets and introducing people to the attributes and the really wonderful things about these plants, and that's a lot of fun. It's exciting trying to grow with that market. it's challenging, but there's a lot of potential there. So I am very encouraged by the interest in these plants. And so this is one, and I wish Steve was here, Steve McKay, because I personally think that amelanchier and juneberries and saskatoons and shadbush and serviceberry are all common names for this plant. I think that this plant actually has some real promise. It is relatively easy to grow. We will talk a little bit about some of the pests, but it just is a really nice plant. Predictable as anything. So it was interesting to me that Steve McKay really doesn't really think that much about this plant. It is a berry that has low sugar. It's not, when you eat it fresh, it's, people say, oh, it just looks just like a blueberry, but in fact, it doesn't really, it tastes good. It's not terribly high in sugar. It's not terribly sweet, but it's not sour or anything. It has a good, fairly bland taste. I guess that's the real problem, but it has high fiber, relatively high protein, high calcium levels, high levels of anthocyanins, some iron in there. So it's a very healthful food, but it is a bit mealy. It has a little bit of a texture problem, perhaps a mouthfeel that people don't love, and maybe that's Steve's complaint.
I'm gonna have to jump in here and disagree completely. There are some of the Saskatoon berries that I've had smoky, a couple of varieties, which were some of the best berries that I've ever eaten in my life. Just juicy, no mealiness. The little seeds in the middle have a little bit of cyanide in them, so they taste, just a tiny bit. It tastes like an almond. And I gave those to a bunch of other people. Everyone was just shocked. It was an absolute favorite fruit of all time. So I don't think that that's, that critique of the fruit is certainly not across the board.
That is good to hear, because I've only eaten these fresh twice, and I don't even know what varieties they were. And there is a chance, at least in one of them, the berries were perhaps a little overripe, and I've had them frozen, I've had them preserved, and all of the processed fruit was great. I thought it was really good, but for some reason, those two opportunities of eating them when they were fresh was not that great. And that's the other weird thing. I don't know of anybody in Eastern New York that's growing this on a, commercial scale. Like, I only know of people that have a couple of plants, whereas in Western New York and in Central New York, there's at least 6 farms that have a fairly decent amount of plants. And they are doing quite well as U-picks, selling it at farmers markets. So it's odd to me that our region hasn't picked this up. And before I forget, Mike Davis, he didn't respond to my chat, but at the Willsboro farm in Essex County, Mike is on the call. They're doing a variety trial with a lot of different varieties up there. So I don't know if he's listening, but
yeah, Laura, I'm here if you can hear me.
yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely second Eric's note there. The flavor really varies with variety, and smoky is definitely one of the all-stars, but others are like Northline or Martin or Thiessen, JB30, all have incredibly flavorful fruit. It's really nice. Some of them, like you say, aren't as flavorful, but yeah.
Right. Well, I definitely am not doing a very good sales pitch on it, but I like the attributes and the cultural ability to kind of respond to more commercial management. And Mike, do you know if are you going to have some kind of variety review at some point?
Yes, we will.
Great.
Yeah, ours are still just coming into fruit in terms of optimizing productivity, but we do have a lot of flavor information anyway. We've been sort of taste testing everything, and berry size and things like that, or fruit size, I should say. Yeah, so we will have that. Some of that's reported in our Northern New York Ag Development Program reports that we do on an annual basis.
Are they
Um,
publicly available? Could I get
yeah.
one of those?
From the
Both
Northern New
sites?
York Ag Development
Okay, I'll go
website.
look for them. Great.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, so keep looking for more information from that variety trial. And Mike made a good point that these are not berries, they're actually fruit and they're related to apples. So they will have, unfortunately, some of the same challenges, but also some of the same promise that apples do. And they have the culture requirements are pretty good. Wide range of pH, 4.8 to 8.0, sand to clay. They tolerate a bunch of different soil types. And the only thing they don't tolerate, pretty much like everything else that we've talked about over these last 4 days, they don't like wet feet. High humidity, we can get some foliar fungal diseases and we'll talk about them. They are self-pollinating, nice. And a nice early harvest, 45 to 60 days to harvest, mid-June to early July, making them one of those fruit that kind of reaches maturity before spotted wing gets really bad. And that's a great thing to know because we have seen the spotted wing in juneberries, but again, it just doesn't seem, it really kind of happens at a different time. So it's great. Doesn't compete well with weeds. You do have to keep the row plant mulched. And a lot of these pictures that I'm going to show are actually from Jim Aktursky. He was a former extension agent in the central part of the state, and he did quite a ambitious SARE trial, Northeast SARE, and they planted, he had 4 growers that were all part of this. The plantings went in at around 2011. They were picked, or maybe 2010, they were picking, or should have picked actually 2012. And that first year they got hammered by frost that wiped out most of the orchards in the Great Lakes or the Lake Ontario region. This is Jim picking. This is a plant of theirs that was about 3 years old. A lot of fruit on there, beautiful fruit. You can tell though that one of the challenges here is that they have a pretty uneven ripening. So you've got some ripe fruit and some that are quite a ways from ripening. So that is great for you pick, but might be a challenge for a mechanical harvester. This is the early planting, just the kind of layout of it, heavily mulched, very small plants put in there that are flagged. And, you know, other than that, really I haven't seen a ton of these, but there are people that are continuing to plant acreage in Western New York. Most of the acreage of these Saskatoons, you can kind of tell that are in Canada, and the Canadian market or the Canadian industry is a lot larger. Canadian yields are about 4,000 pounds per acre, and according to Duke Elsner, he has been working in Michigan with some growers in the Upper Peninsula and northern parts of Michigan who put in some, plantings, and they actually think they're going to beat that by quite a lot. So I think that might be good news for us, that maybe we can have a yield that is pushing maybe even 6,000 an acre. The target price in Michigan that they're looking for is $2 to $4 per pound. So, you know, I think that these plants really do, there really could be a market and a good small industry around them. And I think a little bit of customer education. But the growers that work with Jim, they said they could not, once they started picking them, people really liked them. And the U-pick demand was very, very high. So because we had quite a bit of interest maybe a decade or so ago in these plants, we added them. My colleague Kathy Heidenreich worked really hard on adding juneberry pests to the Cornell guidelines. So there is some information there on most of these pests that are mentioned. And we haven't seen, I tried to call Jim Aktursky to see if he had kept in touch with any of the growers. I didn't get to talk to him this fall, but I had talked to him about a year ago, and he said that really they hadn't seen a ton of problems with anything but the aphid and the Japanese beetle. The other the other insects, just maybe because we just still don't have the acreage, we haven't seen a lot of problems. They've been very, very sporadic and very small, spotty kinds of issues. The diseases, though, that has been a challenge. And so just a couple pictures, green peach aphid are also problems for some tree fruit crops, other more well-established tree fruit crops. And so you do have to keep an eye on them, especially when they're young. They can really deform and slow and stunt a young plant. Japanese beetles are always a problem, right? They really love raspberries and grapes. But for the most part, we don't see too much problems, except when it's extremely dry. They could get on the fruit and really cause some issues on fruit clusters. And this one, Saskatoon sawfly, interestingly enough, this is also a pest of aronia. And this is actually an aronia fruit right here in the upper right-hand corner. And that larvae really likes that whole fruit. That would be pretty gross to get that in a bunch of fruit. But it's a small fly that lays their eggs in a developing fruit, causes most of these little holes where the exit hole is. And you certainly don't want to have that larvae, but obviously that's going to be a real problem if it ever took off. And the Saskatoon bud moth, I actually have seen this on a couple of just plants that were samples that were sent to me. And it, just like any other sawfly, folds up the leaves, can be a bit of a problem for developing plant if it got out of control. And we do have some labeled chemicals for that if you want to use that. Woolly elm aphid is an interesting one because it needs a secondary host of elm, and it is actually, it can be a problem. And this is from a Saskatoon planting where it's starting to take out. And what it does mostly for the Amelanchier plants is that will actually feed on the roots. So that's something to keep in mind, trying to control that. There was a description in one of the things that I was reading that said that they actually can look like flying lint when these things become airborne. So it's that we hate to see it at that level. But more importantly, really, for people who are growing them, even in small plantings, are some of these fungal diseases. Entomosporium is a pretty ubiquitous plant, gets on a lot of different woody plants. Woody ornamentals have lots of problems with that. So there are fungicides that you can use, but mostly good air movement could actually help. The real problem with this is not so much with fruiting, it's more just causing defoliation and kind of slowing the growth and the vigor of the planting. So that's something to keep in mind. And this was the one that I actually saw in real life. Rusts are so incredibly stunning when they get a foothold. But if you haven't ever seen juniper rust or any kind of rust, it is really remarkable how quickly this will take over the plant. These are gymnosporangium species. I think there's 7 or 8 different species that will actually be part of this cluster of rust. And on this one, it has to have a juniper the alternate host. Like all the other rusts, there is an alternate host. And it's pretty tricky to control. You really have to get in there. There's conventional, like JMS stylet oil can be used, organic stylet oil, but there really isn't a good fungicide control for rusts. It's very tricky. But they are, to my knowledge, none of these rusts are inherent, like they're not systemic is what I'm trying to say. So you can actually get rid of them, unlike some other rusts which are systemic, and once they're in the plant you can't get rid of them. They will though, which makes me think that maybe there is some systemic action going on. They will cause a witch's broom type swelling on some of the shoots. So that doesn't really bode well. I think that might mean that there's some more problems, long-lived problems. And this was, Jim said that rust problem was probably the biggest issue that they had in a couple of plantings, that and powdery mildew. And powdery mildew is also very ubiquitous. It's got a wide host range, so you're going to definitely probably see some of that. And powdery mildew, this is the underside of the leaf, and the upper side looks very much like we would expect, some fruiting bodies on fruit. But you just really want to be able to try to keep the planting density, the canopy density down. There's a lot of different things you can use, both several different organic products. And if you've not ever used Caligreen potassium bicarbonate, it might take repeated sprays, but that actually does a really good job on powdery mildew. And that is a OMRI approved product. And then, although Jim said he hadn't seen a lot of problems with fire blight, this is one that I would definitely be worried about in Eastern New York, at least, because we have so much problems with fire blight. You know, this is something that once it gets into a planting, it goes really rapidly. It's a lot of environmental conditions would favor that. We don't know of any resistant cultivars. There's not been that much difference, that much research done. And just like with tree fruit, when you get some fire blight in there, the organic or the cultural method of control is to prune it out. And you have to go a foot, 10 inches to a foot below where you see the damage. And when you're talking about a young, and this is the problem with apples as well, when you're talking about a young planting, you're going to prune out a good portion of your planting. And I didn't have really good canopy pictures, but this picture is, for those of you who are not aware of fire blight, this is what can happen. It's not just one shoe. It's not just the main terminal shoe. It's all over the plant. And then it just gets to be really, really hard to spray. And streptomycin actinovate can be used to help kind of ward off the effects of fire blight. I don't know that much about actinovate on fire blight, and Mike Baisdow's on. I don't know, Mike, if you're still on, but you can't eradicate fire blight from a planting. You have to do that as a preventive, right? And probably you could use copper as well, I would think. Is Mike on? I think he was
off.
Hello.
I think he had to hop off.
Okay, he was really interested in lingonberries, but he's our tree fruit guy. So, but anyway, do we have any questions about juneberries? I do think there's possibility for these plants to be really well accepted by consumers. Could help you stretch a traditional berry farm planting, have some early fruit that would kind of bridge that gap between maybe strawberries and blueberries, kind of go along with some raspberries production,
Yeah.
some raspberries.
I found the research that was done at the Willsboro farm, and I posted a link in chat that is also up on the Teachable website. So you can find that there. There was a couple of questions. One was what causes the brown rust spots on the leaves and what to do about it?
Well, it's caused by the rust fungus, and it is, one of the cultural controls would be to remove juniper, which is a little bit crazy. There are some, stylet oil really is the only thing that I found to control it, but that's the challenge with rust, is there isn't a ton you can do about it. And breeding, managing the canopy, managing your hedgerows so that you don't have the alternate host right there. But I mean, they're wind blown, so they can blow in from quite a long ways.
All right, and then another one, how well do the Saskatoons grow in like shale or rocky soils?
I would say that they probably would need I wouldn't say that they would grow really well in that. I mean, they can grow in sandy soils, but when you're talking about shale in the weather we've had recently, you're going to have to water really water them heavily, make sure that they get irrigated. They're a lot like an apple in that respect. You can't stress them too much.
All right, there was some discussion on where to get various, where you can get the Saskatoons. Can you graft good fruited Saskatoons onto Amelanchier rootstocks?
That's a great question. I'm wondering if Eric or Mike might know that, because I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, grafting is pretty good with Amelanchier. Yes. We do have a bunch of native species. I have not tried grafting one species onto another though. But you know, if you want to grow seedlings of alnifolia and then graft varieties onto it, yes, that works well.
All right. And then there was another question about fire blight, but I think in that case, it's probably better to look into the resources that the apple folks have on fire blight for conditions that increase the risk of fire blight.
Yeah, rain, rain and warm weather, and a lot of inoculum that might be floating around, because it's a crazy thing. 20 odd years ago, we thought we kind of eradicated fire blight. We just weren't seeing it. And then about 8 years ago, it has come back like gangbusters, and we just see so much fire blight. It's very, very very bizarre. And I think they are working on breeding and trying to figure out ways to have, it really does also require some preventive measures. So if you have especially a young planting of certain of the newer varieties of apples and maybe even juneberries, putting copper down as a prevention is a great idea. And that can be done with juneberries, I would think, as well. Although do have to make sure that there isn't any foliar response to that. I doubt it would be, but.
All right. I think that's probably good for now.
Okie doke.
Start back
Yeah.
on the next
Yeah,
crop.
let's talk about honeyberry, and then I have a couple of pictures of goji, and then we had a couple of other things. But so Haskap or honeyberry is also from the north. It's a pretty interesting crop. I'll try not to bias immediately about this one, but it's a honeysuckle. It's the plant is very hardy. We don't know really of any major pest or disease problems. You do need 2 different varieties for pollination, and the berries are quite beautiful. They do have a little bit of a problem about taking them off when you're harvesting. Some of them release really it's hard to pick them without tearing that skin, and they are not terribly uniform when they ripen. But that early bloom, it's only about 4 weeks from bloom to harvest, so that's very nice. My limited work with them was on a variety trial with Jim O'Connell, who is a extension specialist down in Ulster County. And we did 3 different farms, had these 6 varieties planted. This one was in northern Columbia County, and the planting was planted out in 2015. Very small, insignificant plants, you can see. They looked pretty bad when they went in. They had a lot of weed pressure. They did have irrigation, as you can see, but it was kind of ignored for a couple of years. The first year, though, even despite the weed pressure, they actually got quite a bit of growth on them, which is great. But then it got terribly frosted, but it didn't kill them. And then finally, we got some fruit on them 2 years ago. So that was in 2019, appreciable fruit, enough to actually harvest. And this year they harvested them. I have to say that the growers, the farmers are not terribly impressed with them. I mean, the consumers like them a lot. It was easy to sell them, but the harvesting is a real challenge. The workers, their crew does not like to harvest them. The berries are small. They have to be pulled off the stem. They will stay on the plant for quite a while, so that's nice. And maybe for you pick, it might be a real fun thing. But other things about, because of the cross-pollination requirement, you do have to be aware of what is compatible, and they're not all completely compatible. So here's a good chart, and this will be posted on the Teachable too. This is from Bob Bohr's work that he has done. And there's a lot of really great, in a very small fact sheet, he's got a ton of great information. So here's some information on compatibility, bloom overlap. So not only do they have to be compatible, but this was a fast warming year. So this will be easy. He's got charts for slow warming years, and he's got charts for average years. So that gives you a little bit of more information about what you can try to kind of put together to make sure that you're going to get some pollination, which actually might be part of our problem in that one planting in Columbia County. The other problem is that these things will pop very early. They flower really early, and so we are still getting a fair amount of frost damage on the blooms, which is really, really discouraging. And then there's relative ripening times compared to other strawberries. And this is out of Saskatchewan, but I would bet that they would mimic a lot of this. But there's the varieties, a couple of different varieties that we actually grew. And, you know, you can keep picking these. So they're available in mid to late June, but then you can keep picking them all through July, which is pretty nice. Just trying to think of what else about these plants. Do we have any questions? I don't have a ton of information about them. I guess, you know, my observation is that, so we've been working with these plants in the Hudson Valley, mid to lower Hudson Valley, and have been pretty frustrated by them. They just haven't, even over a decade, they haven't really cropped a heck of a lot. They keep getting frosted. But I have a couple of growers that are in the northern part of our region in Clinton and Warren County who have very small plantings. And because the temperature is a little bit more reliably delayed, you know, they don't come out of dormancy quite as early, they haven't been as vulnerable to spring frosts. So maybe this plant really needs to be in a northern area. Maybe there's a real reason for that. Maybe some breeding will help us be able to delay flowering enough in southern areas, but it's certainly, they're very, very hardy for winter kill. It's not that, it's just the flowering time. So do we have any questions about honeyberry? Trying to look at the chat.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm way behind on the chat.
No worries, hang on. Let's see here. Are they susceptible to powdery mildew or Russian aphid like other honeysuckles?
I have found no information that would lead me to believe that, and I haven't seen it on the plants that we've been growing at the 3 farms that we had the variety trial.
Yeah, okay. Let's see here. Not a ton of questions. There was a question about frost helping, or straw mulch helping with spring frost, but since the frosts are a problem for the flowers, I don't think these straw would help any.
Yeah. I see David's comment about honeyberry, it's a misleading name. It is. This is not very sweet either, but it is a beautiful, bright taste. Like I don't dislike it at all. It's and the berries, even though they're small, they're actually pretty juicy. So I feel like they could be really, it's just that harvest thing. If you can get them to fruit, picking them is going to be a huge challenge. And even the plants are so wambly, you know, they don't have much rigidity to the canes. So even having a mechanical, if you did even have a mechanical harvester, it would be, I think, a challenge. Plus the fact that they don't like to come off the stem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to move on so that we can talk about just quickly goji berries. Wolf berries is, I haven't really heard that common name very much, but in the literature, that's what it's referred to. Very high antioxidant, has a lot of kind of lore about these plants and their health attributes. There's some cautionary tales as well. cannot be mechanically harvested, at least in all the literature, again, because of the way they come off the vine or the plant. It's just really tricky. A pretty plant. Here's some of the possible health benefits: improving the immune system, possibly with the antioxidant levels, increase sperm production, improve circulation and reducing inflammation, and then improving vision, including macular degeneration. But again, we have not a ton of evidence, at least in Western medicine, but in the East, it's very, very valued. The culture requirements, it has a fairly narrow pH requirement for many of these plants, 6.5 to 7, but works well with most of our good agricultural soils. Likes high fertility and, again, well-drained soils. Needs full sunshine, so it's not going to do well as an understory plant. Very wide range for hardiness zone. Some of the varieties, Crimson Star and Phoenix Tears. I think there's at least 3 other varieties that I've heard of out in the literature. And my only real, I don't work with many growers that grow this, and maybe this is where Eric could chime in a sec. But Northern Dutchess County, we do have a farm that planted these in 2019. They did quite well. They started growing really well. They were flowering almost immediately when you put them in the ground. And these plants looked really bad. Actually, when they went into the ground, they looked terrible. The shipping was very poor, but they survived, and they were mulched and watered. And then in the second year, they do have a trellis ready for them. But it's been, this year they had no fruit yet. They're still being very hopeful. Eric, do you have any experience with goji?
Yeah, a little bit. From what I can tell, the plants are completely indestructible as far as a plant goes. I mean, you can throw it across the room and just it can get baked in the sun and dry out completely and look fully dead, and it'll just come back from almost any amount of neglect. Not that that's really a great plan, but yeah, I'm not surprised that they came back from looking like death. But yeah, from what I've seen, I've had a couple plants flower for a few years and produce no fruit. So I have had a similar issue, and I have not really looked into what the issue is. I have other friends who have plants that have been in the ground closer to 10 years that get loaded with fruit, and they don't have a whole lot of them. So there's just a few plants and they're doing well. So it could just be a matter of time, but I could not really tell you.
Okay. Well, I hope it is time, because they have people asking, people have noticed that these plants have gone in and that people are dying for these fruits. So I think there is a market. It's just trying to figure out how to grow them well. Any questions on goji before we move into beach plum? I'm sorry, I just don't have a ton of information about goji.
Yeah, some people were asking about potential for spreading outside of their planted area, given how indestructible they are, and if the birds would spread them as well.
Yeah, I think that they're probably onto something there. I don't know how invasive they would be if they were to get out. I do have a note here that yields in China are reported to be about 7,000 pounds per acre. So it does seem like they will they'll start bearing. And I also have another note here. It could take 5 years from seeding. So these were planted as transplants, and they still haven't borne anything in 3 years. So it's a little bit like, what's happening here? Not totally sure. They aren't especially early flowering. They kind of are flowering in May and June. So it's not frost. I just don't know why they're not setting fruit. And I think they do have 2 varieties in this planting that were supposed to be, fertile enough to.
Did you say that they were, where did they get the plants?
I can't remember the nursery name. but they were just absolutely beat up
Yeah.
when they arrived.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, if plants are growing from seed, like if they're seedlings, I have so many weird, woody perennials that grow from seed and will flower for 3 or 4 years before producing any fruit. That just seems to be a wood maturity thing,
Right.
where they start developing some fruiting wood and hormones, but it takes a while for them to like really get it going. Whereas if you propagate from cuttings, that wood is already, mature and will probably flower and produce fruit much earlier.
Yeah, I think that's what we're hoping anyway. So maybe 2021 is the big year for this planting. All right, I'm gonna the way I'm gonna talk about beach plum, because I don't know a ton about it and I didn't plan on talking about it, but I'm gonna take you guys, in case you have not visited this. Oh, sugar, where did it go? Hold on a second. I gotta just get out. I want to show you this. And maybe everybody's completely familiar, and if you are, we don't have to spend much time at all on this. But if you haven't visited the Cornell fruit, especially the berry page, I would encourage you to do that. I mean, even if you're not just for minor fruit, but we have a ton of information on this. It's blogs.cornell.edu/berries. There's also a tree, fruit, and grape page, which are quite up to date. But the one thing I wanted to share is if you go to production and you go down to minor fruit production, and then you go to, is this one? No, not sea buckthorn, not buckthorn, where'd it go? Beach plum, there it is, beach plum. Cornell, this page has a ton of beach plum resources, and there's how to grow beach plum. There's a fruit quality analysis report. There's a photo gallery. There's additional resources, which are, I think, under the tree fruit section. So they have a whole bunch of material that support, like, that have kind of gathered together other research projects. There's a really couple nice videos that are there. And, I have eaten beach plum a couple of times. They're delicious. I don't know why we don't talk about them more as a possible crop, because they're very resilient, really tough, hardy plants. And I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that the information about a lot of things that we haven't talked about, juneberries, mulberries, there's some other things that autumn olive, which that's one I really don't love. But anyway, that is one that's there. It's also an invasive plant. But there's a lot of information here. And the other thing that we will try to make sure that nursery list is really up to date. But there is a really great nursery guide on this Cornell Berry website that does also include nurseries for some of these minor fruits. So hascap or honeyberry, there's all the different varieties. So there's the edgeless variation, which has the smoky blue and the indigo series, and then the blue series, which is a huge one. There's a lot of different, and once you click on like the nursery, then you can go down to where the nursery is actually listed. And One Green World is here somewhere. They're alphabetical. There it is. And if you go, there's all the contact information, but you can also click on that and you can go right to their website. So you can quite easily go back and forth between websites, trying to find availability, comparing prices, etc. So I just really wanted to make sure you guys knew about that. I don't know if there's any questions. Eric can probably answer some of these questions, especially about beach plum, better than I. But if we do have any questions. And then I know somebody wanted us to talk about quince. I don't have any pictures of quince, but I will say just quickly, quince, think about juneberries and some of the challenges with, because they're a relationship like a hawthorn, quince, apples, so they share that same pest complex. And I don't have a ton of information about quince, but I'd be happy to kind of open it up to those of you that might want to say a few words about quince or about beach plum. Please join in.
Laura, this is Sonia.
Hi, Sonia.
I've been kind of lurking in the background
Yay.
the last few days, but I just wanted to mention about beach plum because I was part of a project that Richard Yuva did years ago when he was still at Cornell, looking at a lot of different seedling plants that were collected up and down the East Coast, and did a pretty thorough evaluation and worked with a bunch of growers and trying to investigate the commercial potential for beach plums. And I think one of the things that came out of that project was that until more breeding work is done to begin to bring the plant material a little bit out of their wilder genotypes, it's a very unreliable crop, that there are many years where even if you have a lot of bloom and plenty of cross-pollination and all of that going on, there's a very poor fruit set. And so for having any sort of reliability on a commercial scale, there's still much more work that needs to be done with beach plums. I think the wild harvesting is probably going to be the main way of gathering this fruit for any kind of commercial use.
That's great to know. Yeah. I think that's kind of an impediment to a lot of these plants, is that we just don't have that.
Yeah, I mean, we had high hopes for beach plum because it's so adapted to growing basically in sand. So it seemed like a good choice for poor soils, reclaimed gravel banks or other kinds of land that a farm might have that's otherwise not productive, that something like beach plum might work well there. And eventually maybe it will, but I just think that we're not quite there yet.
Okay, thanks very much, Sonia.
Sure.
Do we have any comments or questions about quince? Because I would like to make sure that, I can't remember who asked that we cover that, but does anybody have any experience growing kind of a small commercial scale of quince? Yeah.
I don't have, I've got a couple seedlings that I'm going to plant out, but I don't really have any. There is, I'll see if I can dig it up. A friend of mine made a graph that was, it was an interesting graph, and it was about, one axis was difficulty of growing, and the other one was how good the fruit is. And for the Northeast humid climate specifically, and quince was up in the very difficult to grow, pretty good fruit, but because it's so hard to grow in our climate that they found that it wasn't even really, it's the opposite of like the persimmons that Roger was talking about and the pawpaws, where you put these plants in and they basically grow and produce fruit almost no matter what you do. And apparently quince is just not on that spectrum at all. It's just kind of ravaged with diseases and pests and things like that in our climate. So again, not exactly great firsthand information there, but it doesn't have a reputation as being one of those plants that just, does it very easily.
Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of discouraging, because some of these plants are, I mean, I love the quince fruit. It is really a delicious fruit, but I think, Susan, the real problem is that they are so vulnerable to some of the diseases that are traditional apple diseases, and we have so many apples. You can't get away from an apple. You may not be anywhere near an orchard, but there's an apple right around there, so you get scab. And I mean, if you're going to just make quince jelly, you may have no issue at all, because but if you're trying to sell any fresh fruit, it just may be really tricky. I think storing quince too is something I've heard can be a little bit of a challenge, only because they go rapidly from, you know, barely ripe to rotten if they're not stored perfectly. So let me just keep seeing if there's any other questions. It's mostly everybody sharing. I would like to invite those of you who are not on the call yesterday. We're going to, what we did is we asked people if they would be willing to share their contact information with the rest of the group. So we would send out, or we would post maybe in the Teachable, like the people that were on the call and wanted their information shared or on the course. And that way you guys could reach out to one another if you had questions or concerns. And we asked if you did want to do that, you put your name in and maybe your email in the chat box. If you don't, there's no problem, but we'll cross-reference and make sure to not include people that didn't put their name there, and, you know. And then I think that was it. We'll just keep trying to make sure everything is populated. Hopefully by early next week, the Teachable will be kind of at a consistent level with all the recordings and other resources. But don't hesitate if you find something that you think is a fabulous resource and you think it should be included on the Teachable site, by all means, send it to me and I will make sure to have it included. Okay, we've got a couple other people that are saying they'd like to be on the list, so great. I just want to make sure that we don't leave any unanswered questions, so go ahead and unmute. There's somebody asked about Medlar, and we did not include that. I really don't know anything about Medlar. I know I've read about it and it has a great story behind it, but I don't know how to grow it. My email, I'm going to put my email address in here. LGM4.
I also know nothing about Medlar. I have 3 plants. One of them is Breda's Giant. The other two I can't remember. And they have flowered and I haven't gotten any fruit yet, but I think this year. They're another one I planted mostly because I read about it in Lee Reich's Uncommon Fruits. And, you know, very, very pest and disease proof-ish. Not proof 100% obviously, but doesn't have a lot of problems if left alone to its own devices. But I don't think the yields are very high, and it's such a terribly ugly fruit that I don't know how easy marketing would be.
And just so everybody knows, the recordings for the past 3 days are already up on Teachable, so you can find them there. And then today's will be up this afternoon.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And thanks, Eric, Sonia and Mike. It was really nice to have your input as well. And really, Natasha, thank you very much for helping me with this. And great. Thanks a lot, you guys. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.